A very good morning in Europe and a very good afternoon in Asia. Warm welcome to everyone joining us for the second webinar of the Asia-Europe Training on Science and Technology Diplomacy series. My name is Reika Toja. I'm the Director of the Education Department at the Asia-Europe Foundation, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's webinar. So this webinar series is designed primarily for early career diplomats, government officials, scientists, and science managers who are participating in our 7 weeks long training program titled Asia-Europe Training for Science and Technology Diplomacy. But we're also delighted to welcome all attendees who are interested in learning more about this emerging field. We hope that through these sessions, we can help you to familiarize yourself with the key concepts and definitions of science and technology diplomacy, and to learn about notable examples of how is this actually practiced across Asia and Europe. So today's session is the second one in our 5-part webinar series, and today we will focus on the concept of science impacting diplomacy. So this term was originally introduced by the Royal Society in the UK and the AAES in the US most recently, beginning of this year, to help us understand how scientific progress and evidence can shape diplomatic processes and vice versa. Last week, in the session, we explored the complementary concept, how science is impacting diplomacy. So if you have missed it and would like to learn more about that, feel free to watch the recording, which is available on ASEF's website. So I also have to add to the introductions that we are very proud to organize this webinar series in partnership with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark and the Central European Scientific Society of Innovation and Technology. We also don't do this alone. We are proud to have the support of notable organizations who are contributing with intellectual support and providing us fantastic speaker recommendations, such as today. These supporting partners are the Institute of International Science, Diplomacy and Sustainability at UCSI University in Malaysia. As a matter of fact, our keynote speaker today is the founding director of the Institute. But we're also very happy to work with the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator, GESDA, also might be a familiar name to many of you. Also the National Innovation Agency of Indonesia, BRIN in short. Also the International Network for Governmental Science Advice, in short INCSA, their Asia chapter is also supporting the program. And the regional focal point for Asia and the Pacific of the International Science Council is also a supporting partner. And let me also take the opportunity and invite you to follow these partner organizations if you're interested in the topic, because they have a lot of content and updates which might be relevant and interesting to all of you. So with this introduction, let's move to the next slide, where we listed that what is the aim of today's webinar, what we hope you're going to learn today. So today is dedicated to understand the theoretical concepts and the evolution of the term diplomacy impacting science. And we also hope that today you will learn about some notable examples, how political relations, treaties, multilateral agreements shape scientific collaboration. We also hope that through this webinar and through the contribution of our speakers, you will be able to better recognize the implications of how diplomatic priorities are impacting scientific achievements and collaboration, and how it might work as a double-edged sword. Of course, we always aim for the good, but sometimes the results are not so positive. And last but not least, we hope that this webinar will help you to reflect on your own roles and think about new ways of how to improve communication and ways of working between government, academia, and civil society to ensure that the diplomatic processes and all of us support science for the global common good. So how are we going to do that? The next slide. You will see the structure of today's session. So we prepared for 90 minutes, and after this short introduction, we will have a keynote presentation on the concept itself, and then I will invite our distinguished panelists to join the screen, reflect on the keynote presentation, and then start answering your questions. So today we will use the Q&A function in this webinar. So I encourage all of you to put your questions as they come throughout the keynote and also during the panel discussion in this Q&A function. Also, please remember to indicate which country or institution you are from. It will be easier for me to refer to your questions. So, without further ado, I would like to start introducing our keynote speaker, our speakers today. Let's go back to the previous slide. Of course, they hold various high-level positions, and we're very happy to have them already here with us. I will introduce the panelists later when we start, more in detail later when we start the panel discussion. But for now, let me go to the introductions of Professor Zachary Abdulhamed, our keynote speaker today. So on the slide, we listed two of his high-level positions that he's currently holding. As I mentioned before, he's the founding director and distinguished professor at the International Institute of Science, Diplomacy and Sustainability at UCSI University in Malaysia, which is one of its kind in Southeast Asia, and also joint chairman of the Malaysian Industry Government Group for Higher Technology. But beyond these positions, he's also the fifth holder of the Tun Hussein On Chair in International Studies at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies in Malaysia. He's also Pro-Chancellor of two universities in Malaysia, namely University Perguaran Sultan Idris, UPSI, and the Multimedia University in Cyberjaya, Malaysia. And on top of all of this, he's a chairman of the Business Council on Sustainable Development of Malaysia and the chairman of the National Biodiversity Roundtable in Malaysia. And I would like to also share a couple of his past appointments because they will be very relevant for today's webinar. There are so many, but I just selected the three that are most relevant today. So Professor Zachary was also the science advisor to the Prime Minister of Malaysia before. He's also the former director of the Institute of Advanced Studies at United Nations University. And last but not least, he's a former member of the UN Secretary General's Scientific Advisory Board, and he's one of the original negotiators of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. And he was also the vice chair of the Governing Council of the UN Technology Bank for least developed countries. So as you can see, next to wearing these many hats, he brings a lot of experience and wealth of knowledge to our webinar. And thank you so much for making time for this, Professor Zachary. So with this, the floor is over to you to deliver the kickoff keynote presentation.
Thank you, Rekha, Madam Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very humble and happy to be given the opportunity to discuss with you a subject which is close to my heart. Today, my assignment is to discuss with you on diplomacy impacting science. You may have heard from last week's lecture, it's science impacting diplomacy. But today I will focus on diplomacy impacting science. Next slide. Ladies and gentlemen, you must have heard about COP30 over the last year or over the last month or even today, which is going to be held in Belém, Brazil, in the middle of this month. In actual fact, COP30, the Conference of Parties 30th meeting of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, is really a very good example about diplomacy impacting science, where decisions that are going to be made at this COP would have impact on science. Next slide. Yes, so diplomacy isn't just about agreement. It's about opening new frontiers for discovery. So this is where COP meetings, whether it's in climate change, biodiversity loss, and others, where in most cases, we would have scientific breakthroughs. And I will detail that in a little while. Next slide. So, ladies and gentlemen, just to put to you here, science opens the door, okay? Science is knowledge. But diplomacy decides how wide that door is going to be. I'll explain that because diplomacy here also means uh, the political consideration, yeah, between two countries or more. Next slide. Next slide. So this is the context. Science and diplomacy are deeply intertwined. Traditionally, we study science diplomacy, science serving foreign policy, for instance, but the reverse, diplomacy imposing science, is equally powerful. Sometimes we forget this aspect. We focus on science diplomacy, but in actual fact, it's an interactive two-way process. So the key question is, who decides what science gets done, funded, or shared globally? Next slide. And in actual fact, it's two sides of the same coin. Diplomacy impacting on science and science impacting on diplomacy. In other words, there's also a term today which I hope you could remember, and that is called the science policy nexus. The policy here is the diplomacy, a science policy nexus, where the two sides have to interact in an active way to come up with decisions that we could adopt. Next slide. So just to add to what Raika mentioned about my experience as a science diplomat, I listed here why the locus standi, and that includes experience as the negotiator of two UN treaties. One is on the UN Biodiversity Treaty, the CBD, and the second one is the Cartagena Protocol on the bio safety. Those two, long time ago, the CBD is more than 30 years ago, right? When it was signed at the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. But I haven't really left the field. It's really a labor of love. And here you can see also that at COP27 of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, I was appointed as the special envoy of Malaysia to the UNFCCC meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And even last year, I was invited by the Colombian government to be their guests at COP16 of the CBD. And on and on. And I'm a scientist. I'm involved as a co-chair of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, founding chair of IBEST, and advising the science advisor, as a former science advisor to the Malaysian Prime Minister. I'm involved also with the Scientific Advisory Board of the UN Secretary General. And now I'm also founding the center that is UCSI IISDS. Next slide. And this is a long time ago, maybe 35 years ago, when I was a younger man as a member of the Malaysian delegation to the discussion of the CBD. Next slide. And 3 years ago in Sharm el-Sheikh, I was the special envoy on climate change. Next slide. So, ladies and gentlemen, given that background as a negotiator, I just want to share with you that diplomacy impacts science in many ways. Yeah, that means the political or economic consideration that's being discussed at these multilateral meetings would dictate scientific priorities, what kind of science that the world should be embarking upon. There are also sanctions or policies regarding visa which limit researcher mobility, and that's the role of this diplomacy to oversign. International treaties define what can or cannot be researched, and that applies to many, in particular on climate change. With that, also the funding flows follow what kind of decision that the diplomatic consultation take place in. As an example, very recently and not so recent, the US-China technology war affects global research. What can be done in AI, quantum, and semiconductors. Next slide. And this is one example. The UN, the Paris Accord of 2015, which set the tone for the kind of science that would be applied after the agreement itself. We come back to that. Next slide. And ladies and gentlemen, there are four pathways of influence of how diplomacy shape science. One is the funding and the prioritization. Groups like G7 or even G20 would determine climate initiative, what kind of green technologies that we should embark upon. Then there's also the role of access and mobility. Yeah, I mentioned that. And treaties and norms, these are a number which include non-proliferation, when you talk about nuclear discussion, and outer space treaties. And of course, the fourth one is on the narration and the legitimacy. Who defines what? Next slide. Just a quick historical perspective from the Cold War to climate era. Remember during the Cold War in the 1940s, late 40s to the 1960s, during the Cold War rivalry between the two superpowers, the kind of science that were done would include, here I listed on the nuclear, on the space, and in the 70s and 1960s, this is when number of international UN bodies were set up, like UNESCO, UNEP, the World Health Organization. They became the sort of the facilitator to carry out some of these outcomes from the discussion, the diplomatic discussion on what kind of science research to be done. And today, our time in the 2000 to the 2020s, of course, the main issue is on climate change and sustainability aspect. And this is where we see a lot of science being done on the renewable energy, green technology, and so on and so forth. So that is the perspective, and it changed from time to time. Next. And some case studies that I will share with you. One of the more famous one is the Antarctic Treaty, which was signed in 1959 by 12 countries. At the outset, when some countries which have the money and the technology, they were interested in Antarctica as a commercial prospect. Besides also doing some military activities. But a number of countries were more interested in creating this Antarctic Treaty, which yield in the whole barren continent as a zone of peace, where no commercial pursuit are being encouraged, but promoting research. So here, the key lesson, diplomacy can protect the integrity through neutral zones. And today, that treaty has now been signed by over 50 parties, many who doesn't have a direct interest on Antarctica. But suffice to say, Antarctica is really a common heritage of mankind. Next slide. The next example is, of course, in climate change. I mentioned earlier the 2015 Paris Climate Accord. The Paris Agreement embedded science to the advice of the IPCC, of which one of the main outcomes is for the signatories to agree to have net zero emission by 2050. With that, we spell out the so-called nationally determined contribution, NDCs, yeah, on how this net zero can be achieved. And the focus, the instruction to science from the diplomacy is to have more interest or investment in renewable energy, carbon capture, and of course, climate finance. So it also shifted scientific funding priorities to globally towards sustainability. Next slide. Another one that we must have heard and we must remember is the Montreal Protocol. This is considered the most successful environmental treaty due to its universal ratification, adaptability, and focus on collaboration. And it was successful because it was built on scientific consensus, which included flexible and innovative solutions and with differentiated responsibilities for developed and developing countries. Next slide. Still on the Montreal Protocol, is an international treaty designed to protect the ozone layer by phasing out the production and consumption of ozone depleting substances. Next slide. Still on the Montreal Protocol, I don't need to dwell on this, but just to say we need to phase out the ozone depleting gases. Next slide. The key factors for the success. One is the scientific foundation. The scientists communicated the dangers of the ODS and the public and the policymakers, in particular political leaders, bought that idea of a shared understanding of the risk. And this is the first in history to achieve universal ratification with almost all of the UN member states. And next slide. Yeah, next slide. And they have adequate financial and technical support and non-punitive compliance. Next slide. Public support and behavioral change. I want to mention here one of the success elements of Montreal Protocol is the leadership. At that time, the president of the US is Ronald Reagan. He was really interested in this protocol and he was responsible for ratifying it through the US Congress and also leading the campaign internationally. Why? There was a personal reason for Reagan. It was said during that time he was suffering from a form of cancer, which he took seriously, and that triggers this personal interest of a very powerful leader, and that says it all. Yeah, next slide. Of course, currently we have seen also this rivalry between the US and China on technological advances, which set in motion a number of steps as we listed out here, which include the kind of R&D that are being done, and also how the global south somehow is caught between these two competing superpowers. Next slide. I'm looking at my time, Raika. Give me 2 more minutes. Implication for diplomats. One, diplomats, even though they are not scientists, should treat science as both strategic and collaborative. Secondly, one must balance between national interests with global good. So in the this multilateral negotiation, you don't really get exactly what you wanted. There's always a trade-off. Third, there must be a trust through scientific exchange. Beyond the normal diplomatic exchanges, there must be interaction informally done by the diplomats or the scientists. And of course, supporting Open Science and others mediated by bodies like UNESCO. Next slide is just an example, recent example of a summit between Malaysia and Brazil, which involved political leaders, President Lula and the Malaysian Deputy Prime Minister and scientists interested in renewable energy and green technology. Next slide. And also how this implied for the academics. Research agendas are shaped by international funding treaties. Like, for instance, today for COP30, amount that's needed to mitigate climate change is more than 1.3 trillion US dollars per year. So that also shaped the funding that is to be done. Scientists must be diplomatically literate. So scientists should also be humble in knowing that there are others like politicians and policymakers who are equally able to negotiate and appreciate the scientist's point of view. At the same time, scientists must understand the negotiation processes, which is very tedious, which has its own culture. Next, engage in science advice for policy and must always realize that science is transdisciplinary and networks are cross-border. Last year, I would pointed out this norm about publish or perish, which is good for the academic, but they must also transform their mind to policy. You must involve in policy or you perish. What I'm saying, your research should be relevant to the policies that's needed to correct some of the global challenges. Finally, next slide. Diplomacy impacting science can both empower or constrain science. The challenge is to keep science open amid rising geopolitics. And the call to action, one on diplomats, champion scientific cooperation, but at the same time, academics should engage with policy processes. Science without borders needs diplomacy. All right. Thank you, Rika.
Thank you so much, Professor Zachary. I think we just lost you for half a minute when you already said thank you and terima kasih. So terima kasih was a lovely introduction explaining the definition itself and then the four key modalities, how diplomacy can influence science, like the political and setting political and economic priorities, sanctions, treaties, funding. And then thank you for sharing these lovely examples. And then also some advice for diplomats, how they can practice diplomacy for science better. And on the other side, the advice for academics. I found that very interesting. And I'm also intrigued by your comment that instead of publish or perish, it should be now engage in policy or perish. So let's further explore this in our panel discussion. So let me invite the panelists one by one, and I will introduce them as well. But before I do that, I encourage our audience to start putting their question in the Q&A function, because after the quick reflections of the panelists, we will take the questions from the Q&A, and also feel free to use the chat to do introductions, like which institution you're representing and from which country. Okay, so first, let me invite Dr. Sunita Subramanian to take the virtual stage here with us with Professor Zachary. She's a research fellow at the Institute for the Advanced Study of Sustainability at UNU, United Nations University. She has more than 20 years of experience in international research and capacity building activities. Her main interest is also around biodiversity, similar to Professor Zachary, with a focus on human well-being and equity and how to bridge systems, knowledge systems for sustainable solutions. And also, she's devoting a lot of her attention to this policy practice nexus that Professor Zachary was mentioning. She has been involved in various IPBS assessments as a lead. For those of you who are not familiar with the term, it stands for Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And she's also on the editorial board of key journals related to sustainability. So thank you for joining us, Professor Sunita. I look forward to your contributions. Next up, my pleasure to invite to join us on the screen Professor Rasmus Getzo Bertelsen, who's a professor of Northern Studies and the Barents Chair in Politics at the Arctic University of Norway. He's a Danish national, but grew up in Reykjavik and has a deep personal and professional commitment to the North Atlantic and the Arctic as regions. Rasmus studied in Copenhagen, Reykjavik, Geneva, Lausanne, and Amsterdam as well, but his PhD is actually from the University of Cambridge. Rasmus was a postdoc at various prestigious universities as well, such as Harvard, United Nations University, and Aalborg University. So his main research interest will include the international Antarctic order and the transnational flows of knowledge between the West and the East and science diplomacy. And he's logging in also today from Japan. So already on a mission to connect the East and West. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise today with us, Rasmus. And last but not least, our third panelist will be Mr. Gabor Takács Carvalho, who is a science and technology counselor at the Embassy of Hungary in London. Overall, he brings over 25 years of experience of building bridges between research, policy, and innovation, mainly in Europe, UK, and the United States. And currently, he's a practicing diplomat in London, but before that, previously he worked in New York, advancing collaborations in energy transitions, R&D partnerships, and higher education diplomacy. So before he became a diplomat, he worked as a sustainability investment and regulatory consultant and advised governments and private companies on renewable energy, climate policy, regulation, and ran various projects through USAID, UNDP, and OECD. So thank you for joining us. We will bring the practicing diplomat perspective, but of course, because of your previous experiences, also sharing some real life experiences with us and addressing this policy science and science nexus. So with this, thank you for joining me on the screen. And then let me invite first Professor Sunita to give quick reflections on Prof. Zachary's presentation.
Thank you, Reka, and thank you, Prof. Zach, for that wonderful presentation. So yeah, I guess I should have a disclaimer here. He was my mentor and director several years ago at UNUIAS. And hi, Rasmus, nice to see you too here. It's been a long time. Thanks, Reka. So I would like to keep to three broad areas of intervention and reflection, pretty much. The first is related to the idea of science itself, and I think it's become broader now when we are speaking more in terms of looking at sciences, and in many ways, diplomacy has enabled bringing multiple sciences into the forefront. Okay, so the IPBES, for instance, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and we tend to talk about it as like the IPCC for the UNFCCC, IPBES is for the CPD. You know, it's a science policy interface, you could say. But in IPBES, for all assessments, IPBES assessments are expected to include evidence not just from mainstream science, but from various sciences. And it's also, that means also from the knowledge from from indigenous peoples and local communities. Now, this is a big advancement, quite a brave move that was made when it is a follow through from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, but to actually use such knowledge also in an assessment, to use it as evidence, is something that was a brave move. Now, it might be, transdisciplinary research has been going on. There's a lot of action research that has been happening, but legitimacy in a policy space, right, to ensure that this gets into decision making, that came about because of the science policy interface, because policymakers agreed to have this as an evidence base in the assessments. And so when the assessment is being adopted, policymakers look at the kinds of evidence we've taken on board, and that legitimacy is very important, especially when we are talking about ensuring sustainability goes at across multiple levels, and also when we're talking about there's a need to involve all of societal actors. So that's something that's very, very important to note, and in the discussion today about how diplomacy can promote science, I'd like to put the S with the science, the sciences, which is a much bigger. And now, right now, we're in the decade for the international. It's the decade for sciences for sustainability right now that is going on. So in all these respects, it's all of this comes from the diplomatic space, right? From the policy space, but there's a push towards solutions in that respect. So that's the first point I'd like to focus on. The second one is about mainstreaming. How do we view diplomacy itself? So it's the policymakers, that's a big part, but it's also practitioners, right? So, I mean, practitioners, people who influence decisions being made at multiple levels. And I'll highlight why I want to focus on this with an example. So, we work with a collective of engineers who are trying to promote sustainable infrastructure planning and implementation across the world. So this collective, we worked with them 2 years ago during the UNFCCC COP in Dubai to organize a session on resilience, on socio-ecological resilience. This was a concept that was new to this group. And we worked with them, but when we spoke about socio-ecological resilience, we were speaking about all actors to be on board, that the deliberations of, of trade-offs and solutions should be identified by engaging multiple actors who have a stake. And that's when it hit them that as engineers, they're usually just the people who are expected to execute, but are not part of the decision-making itself. But they have a lot of science, right? But it's also because they are told to go and fix an issue. It's maybe create a dam, create a road, whatever it might be. They are just focused on that solution, and they are not obligated to go and do a deliberation with different types of stakeholders to identify what might be more sustainable solutions that can come up. But after this is an event, but it was preceded and succeeded by a lot of discussions and deliberations. It's a concept that they totally owned up. And then when they had to do a whole foresight review on port infrastructure, they organized convenings across the world in different regions. It was on port infrastructure, and therefore they insisted and ensured that they had actors, stakeholders from multiple levels, including local communities and those who were living in the coastal areas. And for them, surprisingly, in a way, because it was something that was very new for them, they found out that there's a lot of solutions that were already available on the ground with the knowledge that was endogenous to that area, because people knew the resources and the landscape. And they just had to build on those. So the expertise is very diffused, and it's possible to consolidate all of this expertise. So that level of mainstreaming, which also is it's a way of influencing policy making to identify more sustainable solutions through targeting these influential groups, is another area that is something that we should be working towards. And the third point I want to raise is on science communication. And this actually Professor Zachary highlighted um, quite well in his presentation too. It's about how do you get people to take up the messages that you and take up actions, sustainability related actions. And it reminds me of the saying they say, humans are pretty much emotional creatures. Even though we expect that all of us to behave rationally, there's a lot of decisions that are made because of emotions. When he spoke about the Montreal Protocol and the leadership that came with Reagan, but it's the leadership that appeals to emotion, right? So there's something that motivates and inspires people, whether as individuals or as a collective, to do what is the right thing to do or what is the desirable thing to do. And so when we have all of the scientific facts, to be able to communicate it to people in a way that will inspire and motivate them towards action. That's something that we really need to crack more. We have to be working better, not with just the traditional science communicators, but with communicators who are very good at influencing people to take decisions. Just one example I always find useful is this infographic that exists where it shows about the greenhouse gas emissions across various food groups depending on how the food is produced and consumed, and the whole supply chain that it travels. What it shows is, it's a beautiful infographic. It's simple, it's very direct, and people can look at it and say, okay, what I put on my plate actually has an impact on the Amazon forest, let's say, for instance. But it's very easy to make that link because of the way the information is presented. And that appeals both to decision makers at multiple levels, right, including policy makers. So that I'd like to pause there, but to say that these are important points that actually get highlighted across the presentation that Prof. Zachary made, but also something that we need to keep in mind. Thanks, Rika.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sunita. Very interesting 3 points. So just to recap, the concept of science or sciences. This is also a question that Prof. Zachary started his presentation with. Who decides what science is and how it gets done and shared? So very important to think about for our participants. Also how to mainstream expertise and other levels of groups of practitioners and influential groups. And also, of course, science communication, like how do we get all the messages through and get people to act? Very interesting. Thanks for adding on. Let me invite Professor Rasmus for reflections next.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Good.
Yes, all good.
Good. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to join this very, very interesting event today. And it's very nice to see Sunita again. It's some time ago. And as mentioned, I'm Danish and I'm a professor of Arctic International Relations in Norway. But from 2009 to 11, I was a JSPS postdoc at the United Nations Institute of Advanced Studies in Yokohama. And actually, I'm speaking to you from Haneda Airport in Tokyo, where I'll be returning to Norway tonight. And what brings me to Japan this time is an example of science diplomacy and how diplomacy affects science. So Norway, which of course is a neighboring country of Russia in the far north, Norway has a short land border with Russia and a very long sea border. And Norway's foreign and security policy is largely defined by being a neighboring country of Russia. And Norway has for a long time invested a good deal of resources in people-to-people and also scientific relations with Russia. From the 1970s, the mid-1970s, the Barents Sea, the sea north of Norway, northwest of Russia, is one of the richest fishing grounds in the world. And since the mid-1970s, first the Soviet Union and Norway, and then Russia and Norway, has managed those fisheries very successfully. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, since the early 1990s, Norway engaged in extensive people-to-people collaboration with Russia, including academic collaboration. And my institution, UIT, the Arctic University of Norway, one of Norway's four main universities in the far north, before the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 22, I would say Russia and Russian partners were our main academic partners. And since 2018, I was running a PhD and master's course with the Higher School of Economics in Moscow and the Russian Academy of Science called Society and Advanced Technology in the Arctic. And it was running very well, 18 and 19. Then there was pandemic, then there was war. And this course was funded completely from Norwegian authorities. And Norway almost completely cut off its academic ties with Russia after the February 22 invasion. So I've had to redesign this particular activity with other partners. And the Norwegian funding scheme, which funds this activity, is for Norway's activities, academic relations outside Europe. So the partners now are Brazil, Canada, China, India, Japan, South Korea, and the United States. And actually, my main foreign partner for this activity is somebody who is well known to many here, Professor José Pupin de Oliveira, who of course was vice director of the United Nations University Institute of Advanced Studies when I was there. But we see very clearly, so I have just all last week and earlier today, we spent the whole day at the Japanese Parliament. So I brought an international group of masters and PhD students working on Arctic topics, all disciplines. We spent all last week and until today in Japan, in Tokyo. But the Arctic is very much an example of how diplomacy, how international politics, international security affects scientific cooperation very directly. That there was very limited circumpolar Arctic, and when we say circumpolar, it's all the way around the Arctic, and there are 8 Arctic states: the Russian Federation, which is close to half the Arctic, then the 5 Nordic countries, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, the Kingdom of Denmark because of Greenland, Canada, and the United States because of Alaska. So during the Cold War, there was very little collaboration between the Soviet Union and the Nordic and North American Arctic states. Then after the Cold War, there was very extensive circumpolar collaboration. And today, the Arctic is cut in two. It is completely cut in two, where you have the Russian half of the Arctic and then the NATO half of the Arctic, the 5 Nordic countries in North America. And another area where we see very clearly that diplomacy, international politics affects Arctic science, it's the US-China competition, where I myself I have been very engaged in first Sino-Danish academic relations since 2012, and then Sino-Nordic academic relations, and I was very engaged in Norwegian-Russian academic relations since 2014. And 10, 15 years ago, there was the Nordic countries invested a lot of money and political capital in academic relations with China, very much in the spirit of globalization. And now, of course, the Nordic countries, Europe, are being dragged very fast into the Sino-American confrontation, where Europe, the Nordic countries, are very fast pulling back from their scientific collaboration with China. Personally, I think the Nordic countries and Europe misunderstand their position towards China. I think the Europe confuses America's interests vis-a-vis China with Europe's interests. So we do see there what Professor Zachary Hamid was talking about with diplomacy affecting science. We see that very clearly in polar science, in Arctic science. And of course, there's often a lot of concern about this division of Arctic science. There's often a lot of concern concerning climate science, that various climate models depend on very large data sets, very long time series that should not be interrupted. And now there's great problems, how to say, keeping an integrated, complete data set, climate data set for the Arctic, because of this deep conflict between Russia and the West and United States and China. But I also think as a political scientist myself, I would not underestimate the importance of social sciences and humanities in science diplomacy. I'm a professor of international relations myself, and I have the last 10, 11 years, I have been part of different Arctic security track 2 processes, where academics from East Asia, Russia, Northern Europe, North America, sometimes together with senior military people, senior intelligence people, senior politicians, where we sit down in a closed confidential atmosphere and talk about Arctic security. And that is almost completely gone. And I'm very concerned about that. And as I say, there's a lot of attention to the damage to climate science from the West refusing to scientifically engage with Russia. But I think also in terms of, for example, international security, I think it's very dangerous when people refuse to talk to each other at the academic level. And there, I must say, I blame it largely on Europe, especially on Europe, where it seems to be that Europe has great difficulty talking to people that we disagree with. And we simply have, for many people, it seems to be very difficult to sit down and have a deep analytical, strategic discussion with people who you have very diverging views, very diverging interests with. And I think that is a very, very dangerous situation. So I'll just conclude and say that, and also a personal reflection, pointing back to my time at United Nations University 15 years ago, that one of the many things I learned at United Nations University, it is, of course, how big the world is. And as a Scandinavian, it's very, very good to be reminded how big the world is. And now, having brought some Scandinavian graduate students to Tokyo these days, some of them, it was first time they visited Asia, and it was, of course, an incredible experience for them. And of course, the reality is that the world is so big, and the West is such a small minority of the world. And power is shifting very much from the West to the West. And science and technology has a lot to do with that. But it seems to be that many people in the West have great trouble, how to say, they have great trouble coming to terms with the big world, and a big world not dominated by them. And I think we all face very serious and potentially very dangerous crises because of that. And science, technology, and science diplomacy play a key role in that. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Rasmus, for your contribution. It was really interesting to dig deeper into the first case study that Professor Zachary shared, the Antarctic Treaty, and we learned from him that it's a very good example for creating a neutral zone for cooperation, and then now learning from you that this has been not the case since the past 5 years, and the trajectory is also not very encouraging in this example, how diplomacy is impacting science. Thank you so much. And then just to close the reflection round, let me invite Mr. Gabor Takács to also contribute to the discussion.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here with you in this panel and to talk to the audience. Actually, the previous presentations and thoughts perfectly outlined many challenges in the multilateral world, and I'm a bilateral diplomat, and most or some of the people in the audience will be bilateral diplomats, and actually Professor Bertelsen set out many thoughts that I wanted to share with you. So basically I'm going to talk about four things. One, the context, which previously you heard about, that the national security and national interests give the guidance for diplomats, whether they are in the multilateral arena or in a bilateral relation. And I'm a bilateral diplomat, and as I said, most of you will end up or will do some kind of bilateral work. But it is very important to be aware of the multilateral context. And I see it in that the people who understand this are much better bilateral diplomats. Because originally, or like to put it simply, as a bilateral diplomat, your role is to enhance the connection between the two countries. When it comes to science diplomacy, you want to help your own scientists to create new contacts, new collaborations, or enhance them. But a big part of the role is to be aware what's happening in bilateral politics and multilateral politics. And the examples I want to give you probably help to understand this. So Professor Zachary perfectly, very eloquently laid out that diplomacy is basically a scaffolding for science as well, and also to some extent Professor Bertelsen said how diplomacy and politics can distort science. And the examples I want to give you and what we do probably we have. So Hungary is part of the European Union. Every country in the European Union, we have our own science priorities and budgets. But in the European Union, we have a collective budget, if you will, for those who are not from Europe. It's called Horizon Europe these days. And there are a few, not that many, but a little more than 24 really significant scientific infrastructure pieces. They call them ERICs, and Hungary has one of them. So the EU funding helped greatly to build this. It is called the ELI, Extreme Light Infrastructure ALPS. That's basically a ginormous laser in Hungary. But it's not Hungary's science infrastructure. It's for the whole European Union, and actually not only EU scientists can use it, but anyone. So it's a good example how frameworks, financing frameworks, and the political framework can help a country's science. We have a big infrastructure that we use, and we invite other scientists to use it. But also, so because we are members of the European Union, that's why we have it. But also, EU politics or politics within the European Union can distort science. And as a science diplomat, my role is to help Hungarian scientists, regardless of what I think or what we think about the higher level politics, because there's a framework that we have to work in. So nowadays, some organizations, the reason is doesn't really matter. For some political reasons, some Hungarian scientific organizations have limited access to EU funding, and it's got nothing to do with the actual science they do. It's the political framework that limits them. So this is the example I want to bring you, how fundamentally politics can impact what we do. But at the end of the day, bilateral scientific diplomats, our role is to help our scientists to connect. So we have to find, in this context of the European Union, we have to find more bilateral channels to connect and help them. I don't want to abuse the time I was given, but I want to give a very few very practical, basically shout outs, not even advice that we in our network learned, which is when you're a practicing diplomat, even though nowadays we talk a lot about that, how the internet and AI can help and diminish the role of personal connections. Personal connections do matter. I think the panel is a good example of that. Without the personal connections that diplomats build with other diplomats and help scientists to communicate, we have a really hard time to really understand each other's interest and build on that and overcome the periods when policy is hindering the scientific collaboration. So I just want to highlight that personal connections with their home country's institutions and the host country institutions really do matter. And that's all. I'm happy to talk more about in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabor. It's really encouraging to hear from you that paying attention and fostering multilateral connections is equal, if not more important than bilateral, because also coming from ASIF as a multilateral institution, sometimes we feel like the world doesn't really go that way. But thanks for the encouragement and advice that this is indeed very important. So to finish this round, thank you so much for your reflections and adding on to the keynote presentation. And now we are ready to move to the questions in the Q&A function. So let me start with a question from Sharon Lecoq from the Belgian Science Policy Office. So she's thanking for the interesting presentations and contributions, but asking you to reflect on science diplomacy in an era marked by the so-called post-truth. So maybe let me give or invite Dr. Sunita to answer this first, because she was talking about the multiple variety of knowledge, and knowledge is out there. So it's already very difficult to decide what counts as science and what not. And then especially in an era of post-truth, how shall we go about this?
Yeah, there is no single, I mean, there's no magic bullet, right? We are constantly waging this battle with misinformation and yeah, and disinformation sources. But methodologies are being developed or are being refined. They have been developed and are being refined, especially with looking at weaving across multiple evidence bases. Okay, so I mean, they call it weaving knowledge systems. We could call it multiple things, but it's basically a way of vetting and validating different knowledge that we have, different information sources, we can say, but it's various ways of knowing a particular truth that we are trying to see. And there are several methodologies, and I guess it's a little bit to what Rasmus spoke about, in social sciences especially. This becomes much more visible, because we are trying to find solutions for issues. So what kinds of actions need to be taken? There's hard science that might be required, very technical inputs that might be required. But to get to the point of what is it that we will integrate, we need to have a level of deliberations that comes, if they are all more social science methods, right, that allow this kind of deliberations to take place. But it's also about then getting the different stakeholders to engage and to validate the effectiveness of various interventions. And that's being done. For instance, in let's say in the case of, I know in India, for instance, people are looking at, so the ratio of doctors to patients is not that very it's not so high. But then there are several local healers and traditional medical practitioners on the ground who can provide various services. But that requires also a level of vetting to see if those practices are good or need to be discarded, right? And the best source, of course, are the communities themselves, but also a peer assessment among different types, among doctors. And they can come from traditional medicine practices. They could also come from modern medical practices. So it's a combination of different medical sciences. But then there have been experiments or initiatives where a panel of different medical experts, along with community members, have sat together and looked at the practices on the ground for major primary healthcare needs. And an assessment was done. And then they identified practices that need to be strengthened, practices that just need to be discarded, which are just, it's just hearsay. But it's possible to, it was a very robust system, so that at the end of the day, they were able to identify what resources, what practices, what knowledge systems can be weaved together that will allow better primary healthcare facilities for a particular area. So these methodologies exist. And of course, it's also up to what is the need, right? So we also have to be innovative on this. But essentially, it is about people to people, building trust and having these deliberations between different expertise, that and having this open mind. So the point, transdisciplinary research basically speaks to this. It's very solutions focused. It's involving different disciplines, scientific disciplines, knowledge systems, and stakeholder groups to identify solutions. But it's easier said than done, right? It requires us to invest quite a lot of energy, resources, and of course some level of funding also that has to be directed towards this kind of work. But the outcomes can be much, much more effective, and that's there. The evidence is also there to show that. So dealing with it, dealing with misinformation, dealing with this kind of the post-truth thing really needs us to be much more vigilant and much more interactive with our peers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sunita. So, one of the solutions you mentioned also, we need to build trust between diplomats and scientists. But we also have a question here from Sarah Deal from Germany, who's asking about what about trust across states as well? Because she says that you all speakers rightly pointed out that leadership and trust are key when negotiating international agreements, especially on technology-related issues and climate change. But nowadays, it can be observed that neither agreement or the necessity of binding regulation is there. And there's a lack of trust between states and international organizations in science as well. So nobody's trusting nobody. So how can we deal with this? That's the question. And I leave this open. I don't know who would like to go and take this one. Yes, Professor Rasmus.
Yeah, thank you. And the question of trust, it's a very, very interesting question. And what trust is a very interesting question. I co-supervised actually a German PhD student who wrote about military trust building. And I think when it comes to trust, we should be very self-conscious about what we mean with trust. Because I think so in how to say in personal relationships, it's probably reasonable to say that trust is that somebody else will be will take our interest into consideration, will be considerate to us, kind to us, etc. And I suspect that some people may, unconsciously take that concept of trust into international relations, and then it's very easy to get disappointed. I think people perhaps unconsciously may think that trust is that they think other people think like them, that they have the same interests, that they will, behave in beneficial ways. And then it's very, very easy to get very disappointed. So, for example, a moment ago, I mentioned that Norway had invested a lot in people-to-people relations with Russia and academic relations with Russia. And many people in Norway were incredibly disappointed when Russia invaded Ukraine and the full-scale invasion in 22. They were, and you had statements by mayors, etc., in northern Norway who had been very involved in this people-to-people collaboration with Russia, who were like personally disappointed by this invasion. And of course, I would say, looking at it from the outside, it's ridiculous to think that northern Norway, northwest Russia, people-to-people relations would have any bearing of Russian decision-making concerning Ukraine. So perhaps if one turns into a somewhat more cynical view of trust, I think a more useful concept of trust for international politics is basically that the counterpart is rational within his or her own logic, rational and competent. And there it becomes very important that you know your counterpart very well. Not because you like your counterpart or because you agree with your counterpart, but so that you understand the rationality of your counterpart very well, and you can trust that your counterpart is acting within his or her rationality. So that was perhaps not a very positive take on trust, but perhaps a take on trust where one is less likely to be disappointed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Rasmus. Very interesting insight. Let me go to another set of questions because there's actually two participants who would like to know more about your call for policy or perish instead of publish or perish. Professor Zakri, back to you. So we have here Francesco from Berlin. Who's asking that scientific work in an ideal world is already in line with relevant that is relevant to society and policy because it wouldn't be funded otherwise. So how can they actually get better involved into this policy or parish logic? And also we have Jabaradinat Krushnan from also a German university asking that there are already so many actors contributing to bridge the gap between science and diplomats. So what can they do as research managers in their role, and how is it possible at all to shift the mindset from publish or perish towards policy advice or perish? Can you give us
Thank
more
you.
to that?
Thank you very much for this question, which I like very much to respond to. In academia, there's always been publish or perish. That's the mantra. And this is your route to get your promotion to a professorial appointment in your later years. But the question is, in particular today, in our challenging environment, can start from climate change, biodiversity loss, or pollution, just to name a three. One issue that must be addressed by the academics is whether the research that they are pursuing contribute to responding to some of these challenges. Can be at the global level, can be at the regional level, it can be at the national level. Whether that research, that publication, which earn you your promotion, would figure in being relevant to respond to those questions. If they cannot respond, for instance, you do a lot of research on water quality and availability, but if you cannot solve the problem of water, clean water, sanitation, then the relevance is low. That's what we meant that's why we meant that research needs now to be more oriented to solving this pressing global problem. So you have to respond to what the policymakers are looking into. Because in the science policy interface, what the scientists advise must make sense to the policymakers, who would then have the capacity to make the necessary policies, strategies, or program. So it's not good to just publish in peer-reviewed journal. It has to go beyond that. And that applies not only to the hard sciences, but also to the soft sciences, social sciences, and humanities. And worldwide, this element has not been taken into serious consideration by university academics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Zakri. The next question I would like to address to Mr. Gabor. It's from Ifram Jamshed from Mast University in Pakistan. So he says that we are entering a new era of competition, especially in domains like AI, quantum computing, space, and what are the new frameworks for diplomacy that are needed to ensure these powerful technologies are guided by shared ethical principles and safety standards? From your point of view as a bilateral diplomat, but still paying great attention to multilateral happenings, how do you marry the national competitiveness lens with the let's collaborate for the global good lens?
Yeah, that's a very good and very, very tricky question, and I think we are all struggling with it. I think here one more kind of obvious statement helps is that I think one thing that we are struggling with is that the life cycle of scientific projects, the timeline of science is different than politics, and that impacts that impacts how scientists and scientific organizations can engage in their projects. Uh, and and when it comes to competition, it always means that how can our scientists publish more, be more useful, get more funding? Who would work with them? So, and that leads us to alliance building. And unfortunately, I don't see that that the alliances include everyone all the time. By definition, there are alliances that limit their membership, who can be there, and these alliances are formed based on how aligned their thinking is, and their national politics really has a huge impact on national interest. So we will always end up with alliances, and when we want to advance our own science, we have to find these alliances. I don't know if it helped or not. I don't think it's a very positive view, but I think that's kind of the reality.
Very, very interesting insights. Thank you. And then let me have a quick question back to Prof. Rasmus, because it's Helena from Norwegian MFA asking that, or saying first that we are in a time when even the science behind climate change is being challenged. So how can we protect the progress that we have made? And where is the room to continue to make progress in today's political climate?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. And of course, when it comes to how to say very technical climate science questions, I'm not qualified to answer that. Perhaps Dr. Sunita or Professor Sakri are much better position to answer that. But Helena, you mentioned how to say protecting what has been made, what has been done, and there, as I mentioned before, Norway has, and I'm of course Danish myself, so I somewhat see it from the outside. But from my own involvement with Tromsø for 14 years, I mean, I've seen the networks, the access, the insight, the experience, which Norway, especially Northern Norway, the Arctic University of Norway, the University Hospital of Northern Norway, Norwegian Polar Institute, the Arctic Frontiers Conference, Agriplan Niva Company in Tromsø. As an outsider, they built up very, very impressive access, network, insight, experience with Russia. But that is an access, etc., which has to be renewed all the time. I mean, I've also seen very clearly how one generation mentors and introduces the next generation. And I think also in this discussion and in Professor Sakri's keynote, how to say the personal relations over decades is very important. And I mean, here we have the example of the centrality of an institution like the UN University Institute of Advanced Studies. And to try and answer Helene's question, I mean, when we sanction academic relations because of some conflict, I think there also has to be a deep strategic reflection about how we keep what do we do at the other end of these sanctions? And the longer these sanctions continue, the longer the gap is going to be. And you have people retiring, people passing away, and you don't have the next generation being mentored, being trained in this? Thank you very much.
Can I interject a bit, Raika, on this question?
Yes, Prof. Zakri.
Yes, and this relates to the ongoing issue when one powerful and the richest head of state mentioned that climate change is a big hoax. I mean, we scientists can just take it as a statement, but really, the scientific community, in the case of climate change, would be the IPCC. In the case of biodiversity, it would be IPBES. Those two bodies of scientists have gone through the rigor of assessing all that is to be assessed within the scientific literature. And you can be very sure that the science is very solid. But again, here is the linkage that we started earlier in this dialogue, the impact of diplomacy on science and the impact of science on diplomacy. I would imagine this some of the political views are quite transient, and eventually the truth would prevail. So, as academics, I think you can hang on to it, as they say, on the basis of three criteria that you must hold. Number one is credibility. Credibility is the research and publication that an academic would have credibility. The second one is the salience of your research. The relevance of your research must be maintained. And then finally, you must listen very carefully to the powers that be. And this is the legitimacy, the buy-in from political leaders about our work. But in terms of getting some of those noises, as we have heard recently, I think we can just take it in stride. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Zakri. So as we are running out of time and nearing the end of our webinar, I would like to close the discussion by inviting each of you to give a word of advice to our audience, keeping in mind that they are coming either from diplomacy and government or from the science and academic community. You can address both of them or just one side as you wish or feel more comfortable. So please keep it just very short, like something that they can take home and will remember from this webinar. Dr. Sunita first.
All right. So for me, it would be, let's not forget the practice. So science and policy eventually is catering to actions on the ground, and that means it's the people on the ground who convincing whom can actually have a ripple over effect to actually influencing policy.
Thank you so much. Who would like to go next?
I'll go next, and my advice is there is a need for the scientists or the academics to work closely with the diplomats, and we should try to learn the meaning of each other's vocabularies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Prof. Rasmus.
Yeah, actually, I would a word of caution about the policy science interface, because I do think in social sciences one should be extremely careful about politicized, well, in all sciences, but in social sciences, one should be extremely aware of politicized social science and social science, which basically serves to legitimize policy. I would myself be very skeptical of a fellow international relations scholar who agreed with the foreign policy of his or her own government. And I'd be very skeptical of an economics professor who agreed with the economic policy of his or her government. I mean, having critical voices challenging policy in those domains is absolutely key. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for giving room for the critical perspective as well. And last but not least, Mr. Gabor.
Very much in line with this, the last statement. I think we should never underestimate the power of information and never overestimate the knowledge of other role players, including and especially our own superiors. They can be immediate or ministries. As diplomats, our role is to gather information and channel it back home, and also gather information from home, get guidance and information, and distribute it to the home country. But we always have to assume that people on the other side don't know us, don't know our priorities, don't know what we mean, and this way we can educate both ends, and I really mean both ends. So never an extra email, an extra report won't do harm.
Thank you so much. Very practical advice to close with. Thank you so much. A big virtual round of applause for our panelists and keynote speaker today. Really appreciate you taking the time to share all of this knowledge and insight with us. So we have come to an end of today's webinar on diplomacy impacting science, and I'd like to take the occasion to promote the upcoming webinars because we have 3 more to go. Here you can see on the screen what's up next. We will have a session on technology diplomacy on the 18th of November, and then we'll follow with exploring values, biases, and world views and intercultural awareness in science diplomacy, end of November, and then closing with the session with professional perspectives in December. So if you're interested to join and not already part of the training cohort, please use this QR code to scan and register for the sessions. Also on the next slide, this is the teaser of the technology diplomacy session. We have wonderful speakers joining us from across Asia and Europe to explore this subset topic of science diplomacy. So thank you so much. I wish you all a good rest and rest of the day or end of the day, depending where you're logging in, and see you soon again. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you, Rika.
Thank you.